Alright everybody, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all doing well. Just as a brief reminder, you should have read Hropkill Saga, theoretically for yesterday, for Monday. So please be sure you get your hands on that as soon as possible, because your essay on a Hropkill Saga topic will be coming up soon. That is, it's coming up this coming Sunday, along with when your discussion board posts are normally due at 11:59 p.m. I will be posting the prompts for the Hropkill Saga essay here soon. You will be able to pick from 3. I will upload them to make sure you all have enough time, if you have read or will be reading Hropkill Saga soon, to be able to find evidence and be able to craft your essay well. As always, you are free to send me your writing assignments ahead of time. I will gladly look over your essays to make sure that there aren't any glaring issues or make any suggestions on how you can expand on things or anything like that. So please keep that in mind. Please be sure that you have a copy of Hropkill Saga and you've read it, and be prepared to write that essay. Also, as a reminder, 3 to 5 pages, minimum 3 pages. Use the writing workshop materials that you can find on e-learning to help guide your writing. That should give you a good sense of everything you need to do. And also, one further reminder, you are expected to use quotes, and you must cite those quotes using Chicago footnote/bibliography style. If you do not use Chicago footnote/bibliography style, you will lose an automatic 5% off your grade. So please be sure you do that. Furthermore, I have a document on e-learning that should show you exactly how you should format your essay as well. Follow that to the letter. A few mistakes I don't mind. However, blatantly ignoring certain things that I put online as far as formatting goes will also result in another 5% of your grade coming off. A perfect example is, I explicitly say all essays must be typed in 12-point Times New Roman font. If either of those are missing, there's no reason why you should not be putting your essay in, Times New Roman font. And if you don't, you will lose points for that. So just keep that in mind and be prepared to write a clean, well-written, and well-formatted essay. Anyway, now with all those admonishments out of the way, we can dive into the main discussion for today, and that is, we are talking about lordship and rule. Now, it's important to note, for most of what we talked about in this class, we are in a period called the Early Middle Ages. When I refer to the Early Middle Ages, and I would suggest you all mark this down and keep this in mind, when I am referring to the Early Middle Ages, I'm referring from the period from about 500 to 1000. This lecture will take us out of the Early Middle Ages and go into what they call the Central or the High Middle Ages. And this is from a period of about 1000 to 1300. Keep that in mind, because more than likely, periodization, the question of what is the early, high, and late Middle Ages, very well may come into play on your final exam. So just keep that in mind. Remember, Early Middle Ages is 500 to 1000. We are currently going into the High Middle Ages, which is a period of about 1000 to 1300. So, keep that in mind as we go forward, because we're going to be looking at some major cultural shifts, but let's get away from that. So, today we're going to be discussing the systems of rule as we transition away from the Early Middle Ages around the year 1000. Crucial to this discussion is the system of feudalism, a term I'm sure many of you may have heard in some form or another, which in one form or another dominated the political landscape of much of Europe. So, what is feudalism? For starters, feudalism is not a term that came from the Middle Ages. It is not a medieval term. It is a theory that was developed in the 17th or 18th centuries to describe the social and political organization of the High Middle Ages in Europe. Additionally, feudalism was practiced differently in different regions and at different times. Some areas didn't practice feudalism at all. One notable example is Iceland, with its early parliamentary model of government. When we refer to feudalism as a general concept, we're taking an average of a broad range of relative and related systems. But we haven't actually gotten to an actual definition of what feudalism is. So, at its base, feudalism is an evolution of the Lord Comitatus relationship. If you recall the term from earlier, this relationship is based upon an agreement where nobleman or a nobleman provided the freemen with land in exchange for protection and loyalties. And we see this during the Carolingian period at its earliest. The freemen who served a lord were generally known as thanes. These thanes did not receive a salary. Instead, the comitatus was built on gift-giving. Lords gave thanes gifts as rewards for loyalty, especially after they take on particularly dangerous tasks. As a system, feudalism developed under the Carolingians. Recall that Charlemagne appointed regional governors, called counts or comes, to enforce his laws, raise armies, and collect taxes. Unlike officials in the old Roman Empire, counts did not receive salaries, nor did they depend on gifts as thanes did. Instead, they were granted land. That is the important distinction here. These counts under the Carolingians were granted land. This created an aristocracy that was dependent on the king, and the grants of land he allowed them to hold in order for them and for him to maintain power. Broadly speaking, the system works as follows. Kings owned land, and they granted their lords the use of their land in exchange for homage and service. Peasants, or serfs, worked the land in exchange for protection. Between low lords and kings, there could be multiple levels of intermediary lords, creating an extensive hierarchy. Kings, lords, and lesser lords swore oaths to each other, formalizing this relationship. It was reciprocal, that is to say, each person swore an oath, but it was not an equal relationship. And I have an image up here of the quote-unquote feudal pyramid that I think best illustrates the sort of power dynamic, the socio-political power dynamic that was going on in the Middle Ages, where you have a very clear, though somewhat complex, we'll say, hierarchy of people, starting with the king at the top and the peasants always at the bottom. But then, somewhere in between, you have varying degrees of different people who effectively functioned as lords and retainers to lords of various ranks. So at the top you had the king, then below him you typically had large land-owning dukes or bishops. And then beneath these lords and bishops, you would have counts, you would have knights, you would have, in some cases, priests, in some cases you would have abbots of monasteries, and then below them, they're the ones that directly controlled the peasants who were working on their land. And in turn, this goes down as well as up. And it's important to note, here on this feudal pyramid, that this relation would not exist if not everybody was gaining some benefit. So, though being a peasant was not exactly an easy life to lead, they were peasants for a reason, namely that they received protection, and generally speaking, they also received a share of the food that they grew. Similarly, the peasants would pay rent to the lords above them, as well as farm the land and give a share of their crops. So, spent a little bit of time reading some feudal sources today, so let's take a look at how this system is talked about by some of those who lived in the midst of the, we'll call it the quote-unquote feudal period. The first is from Fulbert, Bishop of Chartres. He expounds upon how a vassal should be quote-unquote harmless, safe, honorable, useful, easy, and practicable to his lord. Note, however, that these expectations are reciprocal. Emerging from the relationship of a lord and his comitatus, consider how this formalizes that relationship and extends it beyond the bounds of the old mead halls that we see in Viking culture, but also in Central European Germanic cultures, such as the Franks or the Anglo-Saxons. Now, and these are some important questions for you to all be able to answer to really have a good comprehension of the source. And there is a lot to unpack with Fulbert, but let's move on to talking about Galbert of Bruges. He was a notary who, at the time, worked for the Count of Flanders, and Flanders being in modern-day Belgium, an area that adopted feudalism relatively early. This source describes one ceremony where a vassal gave homage, that is, made an oath of loyalty and obedience. And homage, in case you do not know, is spelled Homage. Remember, this is an oath of loyalty and obedience. So, we first see the asking if the vassal wishes to give homage. Consent is very important in this relationship. The vassal must be willing, or at least give the show of being willing, to do this. Then they take hands and kiss. Does this sound like anything at all to you? So, when you hear, oh, they took hands and they kissed, probably on the lips, it's important to note that, yeah, this does kind of sound like a marriage, and you wouldn't be wrong if that was your first thought. And while we don't give homage anymore, the ceremony of the act of formal oath-taking lives on to today, as we see it in marriage. So, then we have the formal oath, quote, I vow by my faith that I will henceforth be faithful to Count William and will respect unfailingly the homage done to him against others in good faith and without any desire to deceive. Unsurprisingly, a vague promise isn't enough. The oath needs to lay out specifically what is expected of the vassal. Following that, the vassal then swears the same over relics. Now, let's remember what we mean when we say a relic. A relic is a body part or other object, typically a piece of clothing or physical handheld instruments that are associated with Christ or a Catholic saint. So now the oath is said not just in the presence of the Lord and those in attendance, but by swearing on these relics, remember once again, body part or object associated with Christ or a saint, they are also swearing homage or making this oath in the presence of God. Religious force is added to the oath, adding an additional level of sort of tangible importance to it. Finally, the count gives the investitures, generally with a symbol like the staff mentioned in the source. Like relics, physical objects serve as a reminder of the power they represent. Often this is accompanied by a grant of an object, such as a deed representative of the property the Lord grants. Once the land is transferred, the Lord rules over that land, collecting taxes from those below him. He might delegate some, or even most, of his land to lower vassals, since managing large land grants alone is very difficult. Peasants, who, of course, are the ones actually producing food and other goods, pay a sizable proportion of their produce to their lord, who in turn sends a proportion up the chain until it reaches the king. Once again, this image is best illustrated through the feudal pyramid, where you have benefits going up as well as benefits going down. That is not to say that these people were, once again, all living comfortably or equally, quite the opposite in fact. However, there's almost always, once again, a benefit to being in the position you are in. That is not to say that a peasant wouldn't have wished to be, up here or possibly even king, but at the same time, it's not as though they were just working and getting no benefit from it. So, let us discuss some potential problems for the feudal system. For one, not all vassals are equal, as I've mentioned. As a lord, do you value more a vassal who pays you more, even if that's just because he has more land? As a vassal, what happens if you end up with more vassals below you than the king does? Do you become the king then? This is, after all, rather like what happened to bring the Carolingians into power. That aside, as king, what happens when your vassals start fighting each other? If nearly all your support comes from the very people fighting below you, how can you intervene? How do you stop a lower vassal from accruing too much power? Although the king is meant to own all the land, how do you insist that the land 3 successive generations of a family held are still his? Now, what happens if you inherit land under another lord? If you take a look at our final primary source, you can see some of the gymnastics lords need to pull to avoid violating oaths to their lords. Of course, there are some external factors. When famine strikes, peasants don't have to feed their families and give to their lords. Who pays for that? The peasants who might starve, denying everyone of their income, the lord, who can't pay his own dues, or the king, who now doesn't have the wealth to run a court or wage war. What if the Pope demands taxes for a crusade? More on that later. All these are potential problems medieval people could, and absolutely did, face. So, as a final point, remember that the church has its own hierarchy, which doesn't submit to the monarchical hierarchy. But while the land is often granted by lords, the church doesn't conceive of it like a feudal grant. After all, the land is granted to God, not his temporal representatives. And the church tends to accrue lands, not always to the pleasure of lords. Once again, this becomes a major issue later on. Now, remembering that feudalism isn't the same everywhere, let's take a look at some of the biggest fans of feudalism, the Normans. So, first things first, let's meet these Normans. Where do they come from? Well, the name itself is kind of a clue. Norman, well, that term comes from the term Northmen, or Vikings, who settled in northwest Francia during the reign of Charlemagne's great-great-grandson, Charles III. By the end of the 9th century, it had become clear that the French kings were ill-equipped to counter these fast-raiding parties. Local fast response times and fortifications were better suited to handle Vikings, but at the same time, nothing was to really stop the Vikings from sailing up the Seine and looting the area around Paris itself, an area steadily becoming the capital of the developing French kingdom. In 911, a Viking named Rollo was raiding Francia, and once more Charles III could not stop him. Instead, Charles III offered him a grant of land, making Rollo his vassal, and using him to defend the region. The settlers, the quote-unquote Normans, expand against other French vassals, creating what is known as the Duchy of Normandy. Despite the Normans' origins as Vikings, the Normans quickly merged their traditions with those of the Franks. They adopt the Frankish military strategy, emphasizing increasingly large castle building, fighting from horseback, and the use of chainmail armor. You can see a representation of the armor here. As part of their settlement, they are required to convert to Christianity, and they rapidly adopt the faith. They support the Benedictine reforms as part of encouraging the growth of monasteries. Many go on pilgrimage to Rome and the Holy Land, though some of their travels to these places are less than peaceful. Furthermore, they adopt the feudal system throughout their newly created duchy. And they do not stop there. By 1100, they have expanded not only in France, but elsewhere in Europe. And this map, if it's not clear, the little areas shaded in black are the areas that were owned by the Normans. By 1100, they had expanded not only in France, but elsewhere in Europe. Sicily and Naples, modern-day southern Italy, are conquered by the Normans, who push out both Muslims and Byzantines. They also take a leading role in the Crusades, a topic for later in this week. Where they go, they take the system of feudalism with them. They also conquered England. That's an event we need to unpack. So, for the Normans, things begin in 1066 with the death of Edward the Confessor, the King of England. He was the son of Ethelred, who was given the nickname of Badly Advised King because he failed to defend England from the Danish invasions. After Ethelred's death, Edward did not become king right away. Instead, England was briefly ruled by Canute, who was also the king of Denmark and Norway. Edward was living in exile in Normandy and came back to be king after Canute and his sons died. Edward is very religious. That's what the, eponym Confessor refers to, but he's not very much of a strong central leader. Edward made a lot of Norman friends while living in Normandy, and when he came to power, he named many of them to powerful positions. At home, one of the lords in England, Godwin, the Duke of Wessex, is himself restless and power-hungry. So is his son, Harold Godwinson. Power is divided in Edward's England, with several very powerful vassals with agendas of their own, vassal that Edward fails to bring under control. But his biggest problem may be that he has no son and no clear heir to the throne. So, when Edward dies without any heirs, it is not immediately clear who will be the next king. The King's Council chooses Harold Godwinson, the ambitious lord that I had just mentioned, but as a vassal suddenly raised to kingship, there are others who see an opportunity to challenge his rule. The King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, remembers that only 25 years ago England was ruled by Canute, also the ruler of Norway and Denmark. Why not unite the kingdoms of Norway and England again? Then there's William, the Duke of Normandy. He is Edward's cousin, an old friend. Some sources say that Edward had promised William that he could be the next king of England. William also has the support of the Pope. The King's Council names and crowns Harold Godwinson, the ambitious Duke of Wessex, King of England. The manuscript image here depicts Harold crowning himself while nobles around him argue. He represents the only candidate actually from England, so despite his lack of direct claim, he has support from those who want to ensure that England is ruled by Anglo-Saxons. So, taking the chance to claim the throne for himself, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, invades, arriving in northern England in the same region his Viking ancestors landed for the 9th century invasion. And Harold Godwinson defeats and kills him at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the north of England. This puts an end to Norwegian pretensions to the kingdom. But while Harold has been busy kicking out the Norwegians, William, Duke of Normandy, arrives in England. Harold is forced to rapidly march his army, already battered from Stamford Bridge, to meet him. They meet at Hastings, where Harold is not only defeated, but killed, leaving William, now known as William the Conqueror, as the sole survivor of these three claimants to the throne. Here you can see a depiction of the death of Harold Godwinson, who famously died when an arrow struck him in the eye. It's kind of hard to see, but it's this gentleman right here in the middle, right next to this horse right here. So, William's conquest is depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry, an enormous embroidered wall hanging that depicts the Battle of Hastings as a core portion of the material. It was commissioned by William's half-brother Otto, who was the Bishop of Bayeux in Normandy. An ecclesiastical office was a good option for many younger or illegitimate sons at this time period. With tight, embroidered lines and small annotations in Latin to move the narrative forward, it tells William the Conqueror's story almost like a beautifully, really kind of crafted comic strip. So, after William conquers England, he begins to implement a full system of feudalism in England. He takes land away from the Saxon lords, especially the followers of Harold Godwinson and those who try to rebel against his rule. He gives it away to his Norman followers as a reward for their loyalty and service. This helps support his rule, as the supporters have to keep him in as king if they want to retain their own power. This helps support his rule as well, because William then creates a strong administrative system. He demands that everyone pay him taxes, but in order to charge taxes, he needs a list of all the landowners in order to collect the correct amount of taxes. This is where we get something called the Domesday Book. The Domesday Book is his response to that, effectively a thorough and detailed census of England, one of the first of its kind. In order to manage this massive task, he establishes the Office of the Exchequer, who is responsible for collecting revenue. Records in the Domesday Book show how England was divided into counties and shires for tax collection and local law enforcement. Yet, despite this massive change in who owns land and the implementation of feudalism, these relics of the Anglo-Saxon system last until this very present day. So, implementing the system of feudalism already present in Normandy, William and his supporters build castles all over England, especially along the borders. This has the added bonus of providing powerful fortifications that both protect the Norman against subjects who view them as foreign conquerors, and creates a visual reminder of their rule. Furthermore, William builds a lot of religious buildings across England. Part of this functions as a way to exert control over local religious institutions. After all, they may all be Catholic, but William wants to make sure the bishops of his realm support him and not the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy from whom he is taking the land. There may be no religious divide between the groups, but the cultural divide matters even in matters. The cultural divide matters even in matters of the church. Every time William killed a lot of people, he also built these religious buildings as a form of penance. As he put down many attempts to resist Norman authority during his reign, he had to build a lot of religious buildings to give you a sense of the kind of large-scale violence that was going on in England, while William was trying to secure his rule. But for all these changes, especially in politics and infrastructure, perhaps the biggest changes are found culturally. French becomes the language of the court in England, and laws are preserved in French, and French is used for legal documents up to the early modern period. It takes 2 to 3 centuries before English begins to return as the primary language of the crown and the court. Tons of literature is written in French. Later, we are going to be reading the Song of Roland, which is a chanson de geste about one of Charlemagne's vassals. The earliest manuscript of this very French poem was actually made and read in England. Over time, the Normans and their Anglo-Saxon subjects blend their identities into a single identity. As the Normans become English, what being English means incorporates parts of both Norman and Anglo-Saxon identities. Old English and French collide, resulting in the ridiculous mixture that is what our modern English is. English has pairs of synonyms, such as kingly or royal, or sheep and mutton, one of which comes from Old English and the other comes from French, to give you a sense of how deeply this cultural integration and intermixing actually really commingled. Well, that's it for today, and then before too long, we're going to be talking about the Crusades.